Hello and welcome to A Call to Arms, a series of interviews discussing a range of issues relevant to defence with UK practitioners at the top of their profession. I'm Andy Young and I work for the Military Sciences Research Group here at the Royal United Services Institute on Whitehall. Each month, I will host an interview with a senior leader from within the UK Armed Forces, exploring the issues that face defence today and tomorrow, giving you the inside story on how the military orientates itself to face future challenges. This series is kindly supported by Airbus, a company that employs 12,500 people around the UK and contributes £7 billion to UK GDP. This month on A Call to Arms, we speak to George Graham, Chief Executive of Humanity and Inclusion UK, HI. Operating in over 50 countries, Humanity and Inclusion's work includes mine clearance, risk education, humanitarian relief, and physical and mental rehabilitation. Before joining HI, George spent 13 years at Save the Children, where he led policy work on conflict, and 5 years at the International Rescue Committee. George, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
George, could you tell us a little bit about Humanity and Inclusion and your role as CEO?
Yep, very happily. So, as you say, we work in over 50 countries, providing quite a wide range of different types of services, primarily focused on supporting people with disabilities, or people at risk of becoming disabled. And that's one of the reasons why this issue that we're going to talk about today is so pressing for us. And 25 years ago this year, HI was one of a number of organizations that won a Nobel Peace Prize for work that was done to lead to the landmine treaty. And following that, we've worked on cluster munitions, which similarly have a devastating impact on people's bodies and are a major driver of disability in certain contexts. And now we're looking at the impact of explosive weapons more broadly, explosive weapons with wide area effects, because our teams on the ground, and I've been to many of the places where they work, routinely deal with the human impact of wars in cities. And that's including patching up broken bodies, but it's also dealing with the impacts on infrastructure, healthcare, education, and so forth.
Thank you. It's a devastating cost to war, and if anybody ever wants a good reason not to go, you just have to see the aftermath. And there are so many veterans who would say exactly the same. But it's interesting that we're talking about explosive ordnance, wide effect ordnance in urban areas now, especially given the prevalence of precision munitions and the established Western reticence to use that kind of ordnance. So if we accept that as the case, why is this an issue now? Why today?
So this concern about the impact of explosive weapons in populated areas has been growing for a number of years now, at least 10, possibly more, and it's coming from different quarters. So over 100 states have talked about this as a humanitarian problem of concern. Several multilateral organizations, successive United Nations Secretary Generals, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and so forth. So this is an agenda that's been growing for a while, throughout a time period that's seen a number of different conflicts and different types of conflict, but the pattern, the unfortunately very persistent pattern of humanitarian harm that emerges when a certain class of weapon, these weapons with wide area effects used in populated areas, that pattern persists, and that's the humanitarian concern. So just to summarize, it's one of the main causes of civilian harm in today's armed conflicts. There's some work that's been done by a group called Action on Armed Violence that shows that over the last 9 years, which is the period they studied, 90% of victims of the use of explosive weapons in populated areas were civilian. So that's what we're dealing with. And of course, it's not just fatalities, it's physical and psychological impacts, it's damage to critical infrastructure of all types, it's mass displacements, it's the complexity of clearing unexploded ordnance, it's the impact on stability, on peace and security, and it's the cost of the follow-up operations. All of these things add up to a really significant impact that is caused when this sort of class of weapon is used in a populated area. And I'll get to your point about precision in a second, but the key concept is this idea of reverberating effects. So it's not just how many people do you kill, it's this long-term lasting impact. And that is a concept that is now acknowledged in NATO doctrine, something under the heading of second and third order effects. So it's something that people are getting their heads around. So when we talk about explosive weapons, we're talking about weapons that either have a very large blast and fragmentation effect, or that are intrinsically inaccurate or imprecise, or that are designed to deliver multiple munitions. So precision guidance is undoubtedly an improvement over inaccurate guidance, but it doesn't remove all of the dangers. And you can sort of easily think why. So greater precision and accuracy can help reduce area effects, but if you put a large warhead on it, then no, it doesn't. There are guidance systems for precision guided munitions can vary in their accuracy and their precision. And also there are external factors, weather, interference, cyber attacks, the construction material of the urban environment being hit, etc. And the final reason why precision munitions are not always or clearly the answer, or the only answer, is that frequently the presence of non-combatants in urban settings is unobservable. So no amount of precision is going to help you if you don't know what you're hitting. And then if you look at conflicts in recent times, you think about Raqqa or Mosul or Tripoli, where parties to those conflicts sometimes tried very, very hard and were strongly committed to compliance to international law and to the use of precision as much as they felt they could. Even in those circumstances, the humanitarian harm has been very, very high. So, the point I want to emphasize here is this isn't finger wagging, because this is a shared problem. Nobody, whether you're a military actor or an NGO person as I am, wants to live in a world in which there is preventable humanitarian harm going on. So it behoves all of us collectively to put our heads together and say, okay, how do we minimize that?
No, absolutely. And I think there you speak to the character of conflict that we've evolved into in recent times, and I think it's Major Amos Fox in the US Army who's published quite widely on the use of certain actors, both national and sort of intranational actors who have re-established the urban siege as a methodology, and as you say, that it doesn't matter how much effort you go to try and reduce the impact. If your opponent is determined to use that urban battle space in a way which you can't counter, you have issues. I suppose that really leads to another question, which is, okay, so there are lots of people who would like this political declaration to go through. There's lots of people who would be interested in reducing this impact. But I suppose the question really becomes, what do you hope to achieve, given that not everybody is going to be playing by this rule book?
It's a pertinent question that is always asked, because nobody can ever write a rule that everyone's going to follow and it's going to suddenly make the world a beautiful place. And nobody's utopian enough to think that that's the way things work. But people do hang on to the idea that over time norms change, and you can see that if you take a long view. Think back to the Second World War, where cities were flattened without any particular thought about the reverberating effects that might cause. We've moved on from that. We've moved on from the approaches that were taken in Vietnam. We're in a different world now, and while it's not a smooth line, there's been quite a lot of progress in terms of the development of norms that cause less harm to civilians in conflict. So what do we hope to achieve with this declaration? The hope would be that by naming the problem, that by convincing governments to commit to addressing the problem, and we can talk about the exact wording of the declaration, which is still up for grabs, but by convincing states to commit to addressing the problem, by committing to collecting the data that is needed to properly understand it, not just now, but for years to come, so that people can really work out what sort of strikes cause the sort of reverberating harm we're talking about, and perhaps also which don't, by committing to share best practice, and so forth. And then there will be a raising of standards across the board, obviously in the first instance by signatory governments, but there will always be governments who are not signatories who will be influenced by those norms. And I don't want to start naming governments because I don't want to get myself into trouble in terms of the politics here, but we can all think of a kind of spectrum of states, from the most progressive right-on states through to the most rogue, and everyone is somewhere along that spectrum. In fact, maybe you think of it as a staircase, and if we can get everyone to just go up a step, then sure, you don't suddenly make the worst guys brilliant, but you make them slightly better, and everyone pulls along a little bit in that direction.
I think that idea of progression is really important, and just thinking about that, and you talking about that, and with my historian's head on, I've got the idea of the Battle of Saragossa during the Peninsular Wars, where you had horrendous civilian casualties and combatant casualties in the city of Saragossa when the French were besieging it, through to the 1850s when you've got the Battle of Solferino, and you've got Dunant going out and coming up with the idea of the IRGC, the Red Cross, and the Geneva Conventions sort of coming on that step. From your perspective, have we? I mean, we're talking about progress forward, but has there actually been a bit of regression in recent years compared to where perhaps we were hoping to be 20 years ago, in terms of the use of those weapons?
Maybe, yes. Obviously, there's a sort of big picture sadness, which is the end of the Cold War didn't lead to peace and light everywhere in the ways that some more optimistic thinkers thought it might. And obviously, it's, we're talking at a time when there's aggression between Russia and Ukraine right now, which has a lot of the character of Cold War feel to it. Similarly, it perhaps wasn't as clearly foreseen as it might have been the rise of potent non-state armed actors, as you say, many of whom base themselves in cities and obviously have very little regard for norms or rules of armed conflict. So yeah, it's not been easy, but you're a historian and I'm not, but when I think back over a sort of little mental potted history of conflicts, there have been quite a lot of nasty conflicts in the last 20 years, but also in the 20 years before that as well. So I don't know whether I'd pin my colours to either things have got better or things have got worse narrative. The problem of armed conflict and the impact that it has on civilians persists, I guess, is what I would say. I just wanted to mention again the mine ban treaty, cluster munitions, and also chemical weapons, biological weapons. Those are all classes of military activity that we see less of now, even though many governments haven't signed up to any treaties on those things. That's just to give some flavour to my point about changing norms.
No, and that is a very interesting point, because it's not something we actually appreciate very often. Is you have signatories, those signatories might not have necessarily have ratified and might still hold stockpiles, but they don't use them. It's a very I suppose, thinking historically, there's a very clear example there, and that was the British and Commonwealth forces holding of chemical weapons during World War II, and didn't use them. And of course, there are other things held around the world today that we just don't use for obvious reasons. So no, that is very interesting, and it is very interesting to look at it as something that is progressing. But it's in all things, and this isn't a but, sorry, this is a political declaration. There's going to be things in it that some people don't like, and if it is forthcoming, we can anticipate there being compromises. If that is the case, from your perspective, what will good enough look like in the years to come?
again, it's a good question because we have to be realistic. So this, just a quick bit of background, this political process has been running since October 2019. The government of Ireland is leading it. 70 governments have been involved in drafting the text, including all the major NATO states, as you would expect, through 3 rounds of consultation, with the 4th round now expected to take place at the start of April this year, delayed by COVID. As currently drafted, the declaration would commit signatory states to ensure that their armed forces adopt and implement a range of policies and practices to avoid civilian harm, including by restricting the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas when the effects might be expected to extend beyond a military objective. So I don't know if that language is going to change, whether it's going to be softened or strengthened. So just to repeat, it's talking about restricting the use of these weapons when the effects might be expected to extend beyond a military objective. Some people are saying it should be stronger than that. There should be a presumption that these weapons are never used. Others, including the UK, are saying even this language is too strong. So we'll see what comes out there. The other sort of, I think, most important paragraph to put out here is that it also the current draft would also commit governments to ensure that their armed forces take into account the direct and reverberating effects on civilians and civilian objects, where these can be reasonably foreseen. And the reason I emphasize that is because, for me, getting our heads round the severity and the duration of humanitarian impact and making that more prominent in military decision-making would be a helpful outcome from this. So you could imagine a scenario where the major NATO states don't sign the declaration, but they do take more seriously, or they take seriously already, but take even more seriously this question of actually what are the effects going to be, not just in the next 5 minutes or the next 3 days, but in the next 10 years. What are the effects of decimating infrastructure, of having to spend $50 billion on aid, of having to destabilize, etc. And just to sort of give some positivity to this, these are not new conversations. So if you think about ISAF in Afghanistan, they grappled with exactly this sort of issue, asking themselves, what is an appropriate military doctrine to use in a context where we don't want to smash everything up? And they adapted, right, and changed their doctrine in order, frankly, to use explosive weapons in populated areas with wide area effects less. so it can be done. And then just another point to repeat, I guess, in terms of whether it's good enough, but what good-ish would look like that is short of signing the declaration is this point about data. Is this point about not pretending that that war is harmless, that our, say the UK or any other government's precision strikes have caused no civilian harm, because they definitely have done. So it would be much, much better to live in a world where transparency and accountability were embraced, where we say, yes, this is what we've done. We're pretty confident it's in compliance with international law, if that's the case. And these are the lessons we're learning. And there's a risk of coming across as a hippie peacenik. There's a morality to this, right? If you're going to do things that harm civilians on a large scale, then you have a duty to learn from those lessons and over time to improve them. So I think lesson learning, data collection, sharing of best practice, these are all things that can and should happen, even if states don't sign the declaration.
There is a huge amount that we could unpack in there. And if possible, I'd like to. But the first bit is your discussion about actually planning for what comes after. And if you're going to fight this battle space, this battle in the way that you want to, what is the second, third, fourth order effect for the peacetime after that? What are you going to do? And I think you've really hit Chilcot territory there, because, as you said, how often do militaries actually plan for that?
Yeah, exactly.
And I suppose it's the old adage that the Royal Artillery blows it up and the Royal Engineers build it back up again. So you've got that side of it. You've then also got the military necessity versus distinction, proportionality, discrimination, and obviously the humanity of the law of armed conflict. and then finally you've got the ethical conundrum of protecting your troops versus protecting the wider civil society, and I find that very interesting, because everyone is invested in this. So when you come at this, do you view, and I just want to pick up a bit on that law of armed conflict piece,
Mm-hmm.
do you view those laws as they currently stand as being they're not far-reaching enough, or that they just need more lineation under them and more thought to say, right, this is actually what we mean by proportionality and humanity?
I'd say the second. I don't think the law of armed conflict needs rewriting, but I do think it's not a helpful position, although it's a common one, to say the law is sufficient. And that's what the UK position is. The UK position is we have the law of armed conflict, we don't need to do anything else. But observably, objectively, the law of armed conflict isn't protecting civilians in the way that it is intended to. 90% of the casualties caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas are civilians. So there's clearly a problem, and it's clear to see why the law of armed conflict doesn't quite do what one would hope it would do. It's unenforceable. It's basically never enforced. So some governments try much harder than others. Some militaries try much harder than others to comply, and I well believe that many military actors feel that everything they're doing is compliant. But of course, that's never tested, right? Because there's no court in which it would be tested. I'm not recommending that there should be. I'm not saying let's have every single war. I'm not arguing for lawfare here, where every single bit of armed conflict is put through a court. I'm just saying, as a sort of matter of observation, it's not good enough to say we've got the law of armed conflict, therefore there isn't a problem, when there clearly is a problem. So that's why this declaration exists, because it's saying, let's face up to it, we have a problem. So let's give ourselves some non-legally binding or not new law guidance that says, in order for us as a military actor to make sure that we are always compliant with international law, we are going to take measures to avoid the use or to restrict the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. And just to flesh that out a bit more, it's almost inevitable that if you use a weapon with a wide area effect in an urban environment, you will be killing indiscriminately. Not 100% inevitable, but 99% inevitable. It's pretty inevitable. So it's very hard to be discriminant if you're using 500-pound or bigger munitions in a built-up area. And also, it's very hard to be proportionate, if you're not taking a really full account of the humanitarian harm, back to my point about reverberating effects. And if you can't see that clearly enough, can't project forwards clearly enough, then you can't really say you're being proportionate, because you haven't weighed it up properly. So those are my reflections on the law. It's perfectly serviceable law. It's incredibly impressive that we're still using it all these many decades after it was first drafted. But in reality, it isn't quite doing everything that it's there to do.
No, and it is a fascinating point, whereby, and it goes back to Jonathan Glover's work and to others, from the shift to killing at a distance, and actually in protecting yourself, you're imposing more costs and more damage on an opponent's, not just their front line, but their whole society. But you can position, for example, you can have a legal advisor sat overlooking the UAV pilot's screen whilst they're targeting. You can't do that on the ground. So one of those becomes much more clinical and much more legalized or oversight rather than the other. But the one that's got more oversight has the greater reverberating impact. So I can see your point.
And I would hesitate to give a view on the optimal way of doing that. We've all seen, recent stories about the the greater than realized harm caused by US drone strikes, for example.
Yeah.
And that was, under Barack Obama in particular, that was an attempt to do exactly what you described, to make sure that the war was both clinical and legal. But TBC whether it was or not, and of course no one's ever going to find out properly, because the US is never going to be hauled before a court to account for its actions. So
no, and I mean, as you say, one can dream of Leviathan and Utopia. Unfortunately, they are but dreams, and we're in an imperfect world. So I just want to so we've got the fourth consultation coming up in April, we hope. Do you hope that to be the formation point for that declaration? Is there planning for anything going forward, or is that going to be the start then of the new conversation?
Exactly. So that should be the final round of negotiation on the text, out of which comes the final text. And then I would expect within a matter of days, weeks, or a small number of months, we'll get to the stage where governments are being asked whether or not they will endorse it. And I would expect there'll be some sort of ceremony or event where governments gather to endorse it. So what is to be confirmed is, and obviously the exact wording of the text will be determinant of this, what is to be confirmed is whether that is going to be a gathering of non-military governments who are all patting themselves on the back for having agreed a new text that doesn't really affect them, or whether it's going to include military governments. And there are debates about where is optimal to land on the spectrum between no compromise, hardline text through to maximum compromise. I'm not going to hazard a view on where I think we should land, but I guess I'll give one view, which is that there's little point in drafting a declaration that has no real. That's no point in drafting a declaration that has no real world impact. So it has got to lead to changes of practice and behaviour within all the signatory governments. So I would caution against watering it down too much, because if it gets so watered down that a government can sign it with their eyes shut and not even think about the implications, then it was pointless. The government of Ireland, as I say, is convening this process, and from a political point of view, it'll be fascinating to see where they land on that dilemma.
No, I like you, I'm hopeful, because it's got to move the conversation on, and humanity has got to progress forward. We know that that is the human condition. We don't like going backwards. We like going forward, and this would be one would hope a forward step. And as for the government that's leading the process, well, they are one of the foremost and longest serving peacekeeping nations in the UN. So I can only see that as a positive. George, thank you very much for that. That's been a very quick canter through. It's been very wide ranging, and it's opened up a lot of questions, which militaries, policymakers and civilian thinkers need to actually go away and address. And fingers crossed that April does go ahead and COVID and world events don't get in the way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. A Call to Arms is part of the Military Sciences Profession of Arms programme. The show is produced by Peppy Van Arnen and Chris Jones and is sponsored by Airbus. If you enjoyed the show, please rate it and leave a review. Your feedback helps us tailor future interviews to what you, our audience, want to know. RUSI is a membership organisation, and it is thanks to our members and sponsors that we are able to maintain our independence, challenge orthodoxy, and deliver groundbreaking thought leadership. If you consider yourself to be connected to the profession of arms, then perhaps membership is for you. You can find more information at rusi.org/membership. For less than the price of a good cocktail each month, you can join a growing global community with exclusive access to events, research, and insights that put you ahead of your peers. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to welcoming you back next month for more from A Call to Arms.